All right, this one. What do you mean? Sampoong? Department store collapse. A short documentary by Fascinating Horror. Well, let's see what happened here. What did collapse? Let's see. Well, at the top department store, but how did it collapse?
On the 29th of June, 1995, the Sampoong department store in Seoul, South
Sampoong. Okay. Hi, Andrew Steve. How are you doing? Hope you're doing good. Did I just see just now? It's been a while since I left. Kermit.
Korea collapsed. For the hundreds of people working and
oh, in Korea! Well, that's interesting. A classic. Yeah, well, let's see. Let's see where this is leading.
Shopping inside the building, the disaster struck with very little warning. But later investigations would reveal that the failure of the structure had been inevitable and, moreover, anticipated, and that multiple opportunities to minimize the loss of life had been missed. The late 1980s and early 1990s were significant years for the South Korean city of Seoul.
So somebody built shit. Literally. Somebody built shit. And nobody cared. Nobody like, people knew. But nobody cared. No safety precautions, nothing. Nothing, when inevitably it would crash, it would crumble. Interesting. Stupid fucks.
In 1987, South Korea became a democratic country. And in 1988, Seoul was the host of the year's Summer Olympics. As a result of these events, there was a huge development boom in the city, with hundreds of ambitious projects being approved and built on impressively short timescales. One such project was undertaken by the Sampoong Group in 1987. They planned to build a residential block on top of an old landfill. The original plan was for a 4-story building, the actual construction of which would be handled by the firm.
The foundation probably was the issue because it was built on a landfill. I'm predicting it was the foundation that was faulty. The way it crushed, it's gotta be the foundation.
Woosung Construction. Not long after construction began, however, the chairman of the Sampoong Group's construction division, Lee Jun, decided to change the intended use of the building. Instead of an apartment complex, it would now be an upmarket department store. At the same time, he also added an extra floor to the designs, and reduced the number of support columns inside the building to make room for escalators. Zoning regulations.
Okay, that means less support for the escalators. You are fucking dumb. Whoever built this is fucking dumb. You wouldn't need support for everything in there. It's a big shopping. It's a big department store. Why would you do that?
Prevented such a large building from being used entirely as a department store. To circumvent these regulations, Lee Jun ordered that a roller skating rink be built on the newly added 5th floor. Woosung Construction were concerned by these proposed changes, noting that they might affect the structural integrity of the building. When Woosung Construction refused point blank to make the alterations Lee Jun desired, he severed ties with them and hired his own, more cooperative construction team to take over the job. To make matters worse, Chairman Lee Jun later changed his mind regarding the.
So he ignored the warnings, got somebody else to do it, because the others essentially refused to do it that way. Huh, interesting.
5th floor a second time. Rather than sticking with the proposed roller skating rink, he decided that it should instead be a food court heated by a system of underfloor hot water pipes, something that would add even more stress to support columns that were already having to bear.
So he built, likely, the heaviest floor on top. The brain isn't braining, the math isn't mathing, the think isn't thinking. Why would you do that?
More weight than they were designed to. Soon after construction was completed in 1990, tenants in neighbouring buildings began to complain about the noise from air conditioning units which had been installed on the roof of the Sampoong department store. management decided to relocate the machinery to the far side of the building. The normal procedure for moving such heavy equipment would involve bringing in cranes to lift the air conditioning units from one spot to another, but this wasn't done. Instead, rollers and pulleys were used to drag the air conditioning units across the roof. This process left a number of small cracks in the roof, cracks which grew over time, with their expansion accelerated by the vibrations of the air conditioning unit.
Bro, they're actually dumb. And with the rain, it's just like these cracks, right? It's just gonna wither more and more. And like, just like bad weather. Wow, these guys are dumb. Taking a few minutes to make a sandwich because I'm starving. I'll be back. Take care. Enjoy your sandwich.
By April 1995, these cracks were visible in the ceiling of the 5th.
They were visible? So the 5th floor is the max floor. It is the highest floor. And they put the heaviest shit on top of that. What were they thinking?
Floor. Chairman Lee Jun and his staff decided to relocate some stores from the top floor to the basement, but otherwise ignored the developing cracks. By the morning of the 29th of June, the number and size of the cracks had increased dramatically, but the building was still kept open. Loud cracking noises were heard throughout the building as existing cracks yawned open to as wide as 10 centimeters or 3.9 inches. Worried, management switched off the air conditioning units, closed the worst affected sections of the top floor, and called an emergency board meeting. It was thought at this time that the eventual collapse of the building was inevitable. Chairman Lee Jun was present at the meeting when the idea of...
And he didn't give a rat's ass. It's always been just this much people. Why are you surprised? Okay, yes. They weren't thinking, not at all. And he's probably gonna ignore it.
Of evacuating the entire building was floated, he reacted angrily. It was an unusually busy day, and clearing out the entire department store would lead to a staggering loss of revenue. This argument proved persuasive, and it was decided that a full evacuation would be unnecessary. Instead, only the executives and board members left the building, Lee Jun included. They left behind thousands of shoppers and staff, including Lee Jun's own.
He literally didn't give a fuck. He didn't give a shit. He didn't. He just said, yo, actually, well, it's crumbling, but I don't care if the people are there. And his own what?
Daughter-in-law.
His own daughter-in-law is in there too. Probably dying too. Wow, I heard the construction building is meant for level 4. Yeah, but not only did he put a 5th level on top, he also made level 5, like the 5th level, like one of the heaviest because of all the water and shit. That is crazy. If you like to talk tomatoes, if a squash can make you smile, I'm incredibly confused. Wait, they didn't have the metal rods they should have while constructing the pillars of this department store to cut costs, obviously. That also, crazy work. Crazy.
At 5:52 p.m, a series of loud cracks were heard throughout the department store. Staff began to evacuate patrons, but it was already far too late. The roof gave way, and the air conditioning units fell through to the 5th floor, which in turn gave way and crashed through to the lower floors. The overburdened support columns disintegrated, resulting in a total collapse of the south wing of the building, a process which...
Damn, it's just gone! And there were people there! There were just people there! It's just straight up completely... It's just straight up completely gone. Look at this. It's just...
Took less than half a minute, but which left hundreds of people injured and trapped in the wreckage. Rescue teams descended on the site. Customers and staff were evacuated from the portions of the building that remained standing, and hundreds of injured people were transported to hospital. Small fires, many of them caused by vehicles crushed by the collapsing building, were extinguished, and rescuers began digging through the rubble. Within hours, construction cranes were available to help move larger pieces of debris. Not long after rescue efforts began, however, the mayor of Seoul called off the operation, fearing that the ruins of the building were unstable, and might collapse onto rescuers. It was only after strident protests by residents of the city that the wreckage was stabilised with cables and rescue efforts resumed. Now, workers used a special transmitter furnished by Korea Telecom to trigger the cell phones of people trapped in the rubble, allowing them to home in on places where people were buried. Many people were pulled from the rubble, some dead and some injured but alive. After just 2 days, however...
Well, surprise. If you're injured, you're alive. If you're injured, you are alive. But yeah. That's sad. That's terrifying. And all just to save on some money. And then the guy didn't have the... I hopefully he did go to jail, not gonna lie. That deserves jail time.
Officials publicly stated that there were no more survivors to be found, and the focus of the operation shifted towards the recovery of bodies. Despite this change in focus, several survivors were found over the course of the next 2 weeks. While trapped in the rubble, they had survived by drinking rainwater that trickled down through the
Crazy. Well, a desperate situation requires desperate means. Well, dear, that's your own fault, buddy. That's your own fault. Why are you saying the N-word, bro?
Wreckage. They noted, however, that many other people who had initially survived the collapse had drowned due to an excess of water used by the fire service to extinguish small fires in the wreckage. The final survivor was rescued after spending 17 days beneath the rubble. 19-year-old Park Sung-hyun came through the disaster with just a few minor injuries. In total, the disaster killed 502 people and injured a further 937. It was the deadliest accidental building collapse ever recorded at that point in time, and would remain so for more than a decade. In the aftermath of the disaster, an investigation was launched. It was initially thought a gas leak might have triggered the collapse, or that it might have been caused by a terrorist attack orchestrated by agents from North.
They're just fucking lying, dude. They're just fucking lying, dude. They were just straight up lying.
North Korea. These theories were, however, soon ruled out by investigators. Professor Lan Chun of the Dankook Engineering School was in charge of the investigation, and decided to focus on the possibility of a structural failure. Initial testing of the debris discovered that much of the concrete mix used was substandard, being made up of cement and seawater, and that some of the steel reinforcing rods used had also been substandard. Investigators also discovered the fact that the number and location of support columns had been changed as the intended use of the building was altered. This had been exacerbated by the dragging of air conditioning units across the roof, an act which made the eventual collapse of the building almost inevitable. Chairman Lee Jun was sentenced.
So the crashing essentially is greatly was greatly increased by just dragging the air conditioning units instead of just getting a crane and placing them somewhere else. Wow, that is stupid.
To 10.5 years in prison for criminal negligence.
Yeah, good. Sure, I actually, looking at how many people died, bro should have gotten life in prison for the rest of his life. Just straight up. 10 years is not enough. What about the people that died? Because he didn't care. Because he was only focused about money. At that point, nah, bro, send this man to prison lifelong.
He was not alone in receiving a custodial sentence. His son, who had been CEO of the department store, was also sent to prison for 7 years for accidental homicide and corruption. Several other city officials were also briefly imprisoned or fined for having accepted bribes to overlook the poor condition of the building.
They should all get life in prison. All of them. They should get all of them should get life in prison. What are we doing? You can tell he's evil because he has a striped shirt. Striped shirts are evil.
If Lee Jun and his son agreed to surrender their assets to the government to be used to provide compensation for those affected, the Sampoong group ceased to exist. But this was by no means the end of the story. Buildings across the city, particularly those built during the construction boom of the late 1980s and early 1990s, were subjected to several rounds of vigorous inspection. Hundreds were found to be unsafe. Indeed, 1 in every 7 buildings inspected required significant rebuilding, and only 1 in every 50 buildings was found to be completely safe. The Sampoong department store was
What?
Buildings inspected required significant rebuilding, and only 1 in every 50 buildings
Further back.
1990s were subjected to several rounds of vigorous inspection. Hundreds were found to be unsafe. Indeed,
Wow, hundreds were unsafe. Oh no. Because I'm hearing kidnapping alarms on my phone. Oh god, Jimmy, no. Bye, Jingle. Take care. 1 out of 50? We're safe, yeah. 1 out of 50.
1 in every 7 buildings inspected required significant rebuilding, and only 1 in every 50 buildings was found to be completely safe. The Sampoong department store was built at a time in the history of Seoul when progress was prioritized above all else. It was constructed rapidly and cheaply, and it generated a great deal of wealth. But it was wealth that was built on unstable foundations, and which was ultimately outweighed by the cost of its catastrophic failure.
And it costed lives. That's the problem. That sucks. That sucks. Wow, okay. If that many buildings are unsafe in South Korea, yeah, I would be concerned living there. I think many people in Workline don't know the work well. They got some position another way and resend it. Really know the work. The store looked cute though. Yeah, it looked cute. Yeah. Emphasis on looked. That or one who do know the work. Well, this was completely based on money. This was completely based on saving money. Less stabilization, right? The metal rod, like less metal rods, right? It was just completely to cut cost. Then you have right the air conditioning unit dragged across the ceiling, causing cracks, and these cracks getting bigger, making the air condition units fall through. This was all just to save money. This was all really just to save money. That's the main issue. This wasn't due to bad work. This was due to I don't want to spend a lot of money. Anyways, now what do we learn from this? Avoid buildings with air conditioning units. You might get crushed by one. Anyways, like, comment, and subscribe.